Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see you back this morning. I've been really appreciative of y'all singing together, and that song was just really sweet to bring everything really that we've been talking about this last couple of days all together as well. And just, I love songs like that when everybody's sitting real close together, and it's just a calm song. It's just helping us to think about some of these things. So I'm glad to be able to have participated in that with you and have participated in this meeting with you also. Turn your Bibles over to Matthew chapter 5. In fact, scratch that. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 8. We'll get there in a little bit. But 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 8 is the first place that we'll read this morning. And that too we will get to in just a moment. Let's turn this on. All right, so we're picking up on our series of lessons. As you know, we're talking about the kingdom. And as we talked about a moment ago as well, we are talking about Jesus' principles this morning. And so just a quick refresher of what we've looked at over the course of this weekend. We talked about Jesus' purpose and how to Pilate, he said it was for this purpose that he came, to become a king and to speak of the truth, which is that he is a king, that his kingdom is not of this world. Then we looked back to Isaiah and we saw what the king was supposed to look like, that he was prophesied hundreds of years before Jesus came and that he would be of the line of David and his kingdom would be everlasting. And we also talked about what his dominion would look like and what his people would look like according to prophecy. Then yesterday we went back to Jesus and we looked at his parables to see how they illustrate or teach us to anticipate or prepare for the kingdom of heaven, especially for the people that were listening to Jesus at that time. And we gained some secondary applications. Then we went to Revelation chapter 19 and talked about the warrior king and how John is shown images of what the king really looked like compared to in the meat and bone, how he was crowned with thorns when Revelation says many diadems, and he had a robe stained in his own blood when Revelation says it was the blood of his enemies in justice and righteousness. And so we've talked about a whole lot of big picture things, and today we're going to start bringing this now to some more practical application. We'll start tapering our lessons down, finishing up in Colossians later this morning. So I want to bring to your attention something that I came across a little while ago. When I'm talking about the kingdom, we were looking already about the king and his dominion and his people, and you've probably heard mentioned during the course of the lessons talking about the law that is observed within the dominion. And that's going to be kind of the idea of this lesson this morning when we talk about Jesus' principles, is they dictate or they give a mandate for how life and conduct should be observed within the kingdom. But it's a little bit different than laws that you and I are typically familiar with. And so we'll kind of talk about that as we go. One of the things that made me think of this was a quote from John Adams, our second president in this country, and he is quoted as saying, "Our Constitution was made only for moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." This is a fairly long quote. It starts to continue on for several more paragraphs, and towards the end of this really long quote, he talks about how when the people become not moral and religious, the way that the laws are set up in this country will make it the most miserable place to live on the face of the earth. And so I thought that was very interesting, and it really does kind of speak to what we'll talk about today, in that what is required to observe law, and let's define that term real quick before we go on. Law is defined as a rule or standard of living. So if you live in a country where it's anarchy, that's still the rule or standard of living within that country. That's just how things work. And that's kind of how I'll say things as we go through too. Law is just how things work within a different place, a dominion per se in our lessons. Now, Paul talks about this to Timothy, this idea, but if we consider this idea as one side of the coin, Paul talks about it from the other. And that's where you're looking now in your Bibles in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verses 8 through 11. Here at the beginning, Paul says, "We know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, realizing the fact that law was not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers and immoral men, and homosexuals and kidnappers and liars and perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted." there's the first part of that passage, though. There's a typo. That's verse 8 and on. That I want you to look at. He says that the law is a good thing, but only if one uses it lawfully, realizing the fact that the law is not made for the righteous person. What he's talking about here is the other side of this coin. And how we'll look at this as we go through this lesson is that law for righteous and moral people, kind of like John Adams had said, is almost unnecessary. It's there, it's on the books, but the moral and the righteous people don't really pay attention to it. Here's an example. If you are living in the United States within the realm of legality, you don't really worry about when the police are driving by because there's nothing to worry about. You have been operating within the rule or standard of living within your community. But if things come by and if the law is brought up and it's convicting to you and it says something about what you're doing, then we get to see what Paul's talking about here, in that I was not living as a lawful person, but as an unrighteous person, an unlawful person. And now the law has not become this system of living, but it's now become a judgment against me. And so what I want to bring out for the rest of this lesson is kind of the first point of this, is that the law is useful, but for those who are moral in character, for those who value righteousness at their core, the law becomes all but unnecessary. You don't have to pay attention to it as much. And that now becomes the rule or standard of living. So with that, let me explain, and we'll look at Matthew chapter 5, and we will consider what's often called the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew chapter 5, and really we'll start and do a little bit of context here in Matthew chapter 4 in the last few verses, starting in verse 23. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 23. As we come to this place, one of the things that I find fascinating about the Sermon on the Mount is how not only is it fascinating to me, but fascinating to other people in different times and places. I've read so many articles about atheists and people who deny the rest of the scriptures, but will marvel at not only the simplicity, but the elegance and the unfailing ideas that are there in the Sermon on the Mount. And they're very impressed by that. They'll sometimes say, Jesus is a fictional character, but this lesson is some good stuff. It really has great impact in the world. It does more even than that for us. We're going to look at verse 23 as we get started here, because it says that Jesus was going throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness among the people. The news about him spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all who were ill, those suffering with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. Large crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, that's a Gentile region. And it says, and Jerusalem and Judea and from beyond the Jordan. You have now thousands upon thousands of all sorts of different types of people that have come to hear him. And in chapter 5 and verse 1, it says that when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to a mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and began to teach them. Now, as we go through the rest of these teachings, there's three main points as they pertain to the kingdom of heaven. And I never noticed this until just a couple of years ago, that the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is, in a way of speaking, a constitution for the dominion that is the kingdom of heaven. It is now, he is going to lay out and define the rule and standard of living that occurs within this place. And I find it incredibly fascinating that his first mention of the kingdom of heaven here does not talk about statutes like do's and do-nots of law. He talks about law as a form of moral character. The rule or standard of living within the dominion of the kingdom of heaven is your character, your morality, the way that you think and process these things. Now, let's go through these next few verses, which are often called the Beatitudes, verses 3 through 11. And what I want to do, instead of just reading it verse by verse right now, we'll do that in a little bit. I just want to look at some of these points here before we look at their resolutions, and I'll explain as we go. It'll make a lot of sense. In verse 3, let's go ahead and start looking at this. Jesus opens his mouth, verse 2, and begins to teach them, and he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And we're going to leave off the solution, the resolution of this for a little bit. We'll just look at those first conditions that he sets up. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the gentle or the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who have been persecuted. And if you look through these points, and we'll put them all up on the board so we can see them all together. There we go. As we look at all of these points here, these are character traits, first and foremost. One of the things I'd like you to notice is that you cannot legislate these things into being in a people's lives. So think about these things and think about the way that we conduct laws and make laws in our country. You cannot make a law to have somebody become poor in spirit. You can behavior modify, you can threaten with imprisonment if these things don't look like this, but you can't go into that person and change them at their core, at their character, what composes them. So to be poor in spirit is not something that he says, here's something you must do. It's here's something you must be. And so he gets to the root of people. He gets to their very core. Again, blessed are those who mourn. You cannot make someone mourn in their deepest sense. You can make someone look like they're mourning through fear of imprisonment or through, incentives given by tax breaks for if you are mourning, but you cannot make that person a mourner or meek or hungry or thirsty or merciful or all of the above. Now, as we look through these points again, remember this first thing. You cannot legislate this, though this is the rule or standard of living within the kingdom. You will either be these things or not be these things. But a do and do not list cannot make these in you. In fact, if you are these things, the do and do not list is something that you by nature will do, and then it becomes something you don't have to pay attention to as much. And that's what we mean here by the law being a judgment to those who disobey, but to those who are morally upright and good in character, it's something you don't pay attention to all that often. Now, let's go through these things again and see what Jesus has to say about them. In fact, let's look through them one more time and see if these things are ever true in life. So we've talked about how you can't legislate these things. What about, do these things become true in life? Blessed are the poor in spirit. It's normally the rich who run things. It's normally the powerful who run things. It's normally those who are willing to be go-getters. If we talk about not just material stuff, but those who push onwards, who are rich in spirit, it's normally those who rule the world. But Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. And when you think about the things for which we would mourn, loss of family, loss of possessions, loss of the things that we had talked about in some earlier lessons, those who mourn, how often can you guarantee comfort for that? How often can you say, here's a thing that will always, always make you feel better? These things don't happen in our world that way. Blessed are the meek, or some of your translations might say, blessed are the gentle. It's those people who finish last. It's the nice guys who lose out in this world. But Jesus says these people are the happy ones, the blessed ones. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst. And you know and hear about oftentimes there are so many people in the world who hunger and thirst and are never satisfied, are scrambling day by day to be able to find something to put into their bellies and cannot find enough. Blessed, he says, or happy are the merciful. And again, mercy, we're told now, is a weakness. You need to show strength. You need to not let anybody take advantage of you. And think about this as well. The people who might be suppressed, who might be oppressed by others, by the stronger, by those who aren't gentle, by those who are rich in spirit and all these other things, how often do those people who say we should show mercy, when they do come to power, still show that same mercy? During the French Revolution, there was a journalist who remarked, and this has remained true throughout many revolutions since then, he said, revolutions eat their own children. In a sense of speaking, that the people who say we're being oppressed, we need to take power, and when they do, end up being the ones who kill everybody else who opposed them and become the new oppressors. Merciful people don't last long being merciful in this world. Look more as we go. Blessed are the pure and the clean. And remember that Jesus is talking to Jews who are concerned with purity and cleanness according to the law, about what it means to be unclean, what it means to be holy, what it means to be able to go into God's presence in the temple. And so there were people at this time who were acting and outwardly pure and clean. But Jesus talks about a different type of purity here. Blessed again are the peacemakers. And not only is that a difficult thing, but sometimes you can get ahead if you create conflict. If you at your jobs or at your work or in politics or whatever can be able to have both of your enemies fight against each other, you can take advantage of that. And so being a peacemaker isn't always advantageous. Finally, blessed are the persecuted. But again, that's not how we're told things in this life. We're told to trouble the bourgeois. We're told to stand up and speak our voices and things. But he says this isn't the way that this works. The people who suffer, the people who are oppressed, are really the happy ones. But again, you can't legislate these things. These are things that you must be. You cannot be happy in persecution unless you have the character to do so. So let's read through these things again to see how Jesus tells us the reality of the situation. And we'll look at all the resolutions as we go through this passage once more. Verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is, or to them belongs, the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle or the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs, or to them belongs, the kingdom of heaven. He finishes with this, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The things that Jesus says here do not make any sense in our temporal and physical reality. We are not comforted in mourning. We are not satisfied in hunger. None of these things make sense, and yet he calls us to be these things for the kingdom of heaven's sake, for his sake. But again, remember, as we move to our next point, that these are character traits. But this is the rule or standard of living in the country. Now, let's go ahead and look at our next point. This will tie us in very well to chapter 5 and verse 17 and on. And you can probably assume that since we're talking about law, and to the Jews, the Mosaic law holds a lot of connotation and a lot of weight, that this might have been pretty shocking to hear some of these things. Again, they would look at this and go, wait a second, Jesus, this isn't the way that things work, and how can you guarantee things like comforting for the mourning, or I will inherit the earth for those who are gentle? This doesn't make any sense. And so what Jesus does now is he gives them a little bit of a reassurance, but still directs them to something better and challenges them when he talks about the law of Moses and the prophets as well, the combination of those two. So look at chapter 5 and verse 17, where Jesus reminds them that he's not teaching them something new. He's not just coming out of the blue and changing things up just for the sake of change. Rather, he's trying to remind them of those things which have always been great. In verse 17, he says, do not think I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. What Jesus is doing here is he's explaining the important connection of the law of Moses to God's eternal will. In other words, everything he says from here on out agrees with the law of Moses. It is the epitome of the law of Moses and the prophets. So don't worry about anything. We're not changing anything, he's telling them here. In fact, he says, I'll do you one better. Verse 18, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Now put a marker here, because Jesus does something really subtle, I think. Put a marker here, and we're going to go back to Isaiah chapter 65 and verses 17 through 18. Because this seems pretty serious, right? This seems like this is never going to go away until heaven and earth pass away. His law is not going to pass away. And so to the Jews, they would go, oh, okay, the law of Moses is going to stay around. You're not a false teacher. We don't have to accuse you of blasphemy. Everything's going to be okay. But notice what Jesus says, especially the way that Isaiah talks about these things. And we talked about this a couple of days ago. Isaiah chapter 65 and verse 17, God talking about creating his kingdom and this new covenant contained therein. He says, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things," or in other words, the old heavens and the old earth, "will not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad," because that's a scary thing, "and rejoice forever in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem for rejoicing and her people for gladness." Remember the other night we were talking about on Friday night how this Jerusalem, this new city, is this new kingdom. It's this dominion of the king, and that is this new heavens and new earth. Skip down again to chapter 66 and verses 21 through 22, where he says that in this new heavens and new earth, that he will take some of these people, of which he has pulled to himself, and he will take some of them for priests and for Levites, that is, to offer sacrifices to him. In verse 22, he says, "For just as the new heavens and the new earth which I make will endure before me, declares the Lord, so your offspring and your name will endure." And this word for endure, we think of endurance, right? And if you think of endurance, what I think of a lot is I think of cross-country races and running and things like that, where it takes a long period of time to run the race. But then in my mind, I think eventually that race is done and it's over with. And then the endurance isn't needed anymore. And that's not the way that God is using this word endure here. He's talking about it will never end. It endures for all eternity. And so this new heavens and this new earth, this new dominion, this kingdom that God creates in which there is a rule or a standard of living will have been the replacement of the old things. Now go back to Matthew chapter 5 in verse 18 to see again what Jesus is saying here. He's not saying, don't worry, I'm not teaching anything about the law of Moses going away or anything like that. He's saying that the law of Moses will find its completion and its perfection when heaven and earth pass away. Or in other words, this law is going to be fulfilled and replaced in very short order. It's going to come very soon when the new heavens and new earth are created. That's in Jesus' generation. So he tells them here, I say to you," or if you look at the Greek, he says, "Amen, amen, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished." In other words, again, the Old Testament prophecies will all be fulfilled. Everything that Moses spoke about in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible, will find their completion in a very short period of time. But they are important, and they're the basis. And for us today, Galatians says that they are a teacher and a schoolmaster for us. And so, he says in verse 19, not to mess with it. In verse 19 of chapter 5, "Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." I want to take you over to Romans 13 and verses 8 through 10 to see the way that Paul talks about these things. Remember that the God of the Old Testament is the same God in the New Testament. He's the same. And he's not like a man that he should change or like a man that he should repent. That's what Numbers says about him. And so if we look at the Old Testament and then the New Testament and go, oh, something changed, or God is different here, or something like that, we're looking at it wrong. We need to go back and reassess the way that we understand these things, what the foundations and the fundamentals are. And so if God is always the same and always has always been the same and always will be the same, then if there's a difference, what's going on that we should learn from this, or apparent difference or perceived difference? So Jesus tells them there in Matthew 5, do not remove any points of this law. Now notice how Paul talks about it in Romans 13. He says, and I love verse 8, I always chuckle at this. He says, owe no one anything. Or here in New American Standard, he says, owe nothing to anyone. You don't owe anybody anything. You're your own person. Nobody's the boss of you. You don't owe anybody anything except one thing: to love one another. And you know how Jesus has talked about love. True love lays down lives for friends. And so I chuckle at this because he says, you don't owe anybody anything except you owe everybody everything. And this is what the law has always been about. Look at the next line there. He says, "For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law." Now, this is really weird to me because I think of myself as a Gentile, and I have no connection to the law of Moses. I wasn't there at Sinai. I wasn't in the conditions in Exodus chapter 19. And so the law of Moses is something that I learn from and I take lessons from, and I see how it develops and finds its perfection in the New Testament. And so it's very, very important to read and to learn about. But I don't think of myself in any sort of way as having any sort of like legal commitment to that in any way, shape, or form. And yet here Paul says, hey, if you love your neighbor, you have completed all of the points even of the law of Moses. And notice, I don't have to worry about all the details of all of that stuff. What God had designed then was to teach us how it has always been. Look at the next verse. In verse 9, he says, "For this," in other words, let me give you an example. "You shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment," and there are a whole lot more, 613 in total, let's go through the list, is what he's saying here. We could spend all day in this. Let's save some time. He says, if there's any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Let's go back to Matthew 5. And start to see how this works. There's a lot of things that we need to pay attention to. There's a lot of teachings that the New Testament authors have, that Jesus had, which he told the apostles to teach us. There's a lot of teachings from the Old Testament, and we can spend our whole lifetimes, and we have and we will, learning these things as often as we can. And if you sit down and think about it for a second, and I do this sometimes, I get a little overwhelmed. If I start trying to think about all of the details, and all of the do's and the do-nots. Now, don't get me wrong, it's important to go and to learn and to read these things. But if you spend your mind and your energy on one point, you really won't have to worry about the rest. If you spend your energy and your time on one point, you will go and you will learn the rest, and you'll take the time to do so. But it won't be a worry. It will be something that you will live in character by faith. So here's an example. There's a lot that I don't know. And a couple of years ago, there was a lot that I know now that I didn't know then. And you can keep going back, and there was so much that I did not know. And for all of us in this room, we're at different places of our knowledge. And like we talked about a couple of days ago, it's hard to know the thing that you don't know. And so what then about if the rule or standard of living is the full adherence to all of the details and the points? It becomes an impossibility. However, when they come up to you and when they're presented to you, and a brother says, "Brother, you've wronged me here. You've not shown love to me. And it was something you didn't even know about." That your fulfillment of the law by good character and having a single-minded intention to love will act upon what you know. When it is presented to you, you will immediately jump. We're down by Camp Pendleton, a Marine base, and the drill instructors, we're often hear about how they tell the Marines that when I say jump, you're going to say how high, and that's the idea, right? Is that when these details are presented to us, and some of the bigger points and the finer points, the moment it's presented, we will want to do it, but only because love is there first. Now, notice these 2 points, and here's where we've come so far. We saw that the character, rather the law of the dominion, the ruler standard of living, is fundamentally requires that we have moral character, which Jesus defined in the Beatitudes. Then it is also coupled with all of the law of Moses and everything that Paul and Peter and James and John and everybody has ever talked about. But you can sum all of that up in one thing, which is love. So character coupled with love is the rule and standard of living within the kingdom of heaven. Everything that we could talk about for forever is summed up in that. Now, don't let that go. Okay, all David's next lesson is next week when we come up here is he's just going to read Romans 13, and then we're done for the rest of our lives. There's so much to learn, and we'll want to because of love and character. But without this, nothing else matters. There's another thing that I was thinking about with this rule or standard of living. In fact, actually, as we define these things, let's catch up here too. The law of Moses and the kingdom of heaven are not at odds. They're concerned with the same thing. You could almost say they are the same thing. that all throughout time, God has brought people into his kingdom, which he established through his Son. Now, I want to take you, still in Matthew, to chapter 22, just for a moment, in verse 40. Matthew chapter 22 in verse 40. And here we come to a place that you're well familiar with when a scribe comes and he asks Jesus a question. And depending on who, this question is asked several times in the Gospels, and the Gospels will all present some perspective or another on it. And sometimes they'll say that he came to test, and sometimes it looks like the other person who asks is very sincere and just wants to know what's going on here. And what's going on, or the question that they ask is, what's the greatest commandment in the law? There's 613 of them, and surely one would think some are going to supersede others. That if there came a point in life where it's like, I had to choose between obeying this one and the other one, which one's the greatest? Let's put them into a hierarchy, kind of a March Madness tournament ranking. Which one's the best? And so they ask the question, and sometimes Jesus will say, you know the law, what's your reading of it? And sometimes he'll just come straight out and tell them what the answer is. And they ask the question, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus replies, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and some of the versions will say also in strength. And then he kind of goes, I'll do you one better as well. The second commandment is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And really, if you love God with everything that you've got, you will love the people he loves with everything you've got as well, and you'll owe everyone everything. And so those two great commandments are really the same commandment. It's the greatest. It's love, the fulfillment of the law. Now here's the thing. When we're presented with some of the details and the minutiae and the do's and the do-nots, and we're resistant to even consider some of these things, especially if it requires a sacrifice in my life, I've got a problem here, in that I'm not willing to either study it and try and figure it out with said person who brings it up to me, or to be able to just give up my desires and my intentions for that person. I have lost love. And here's what this looks like a lot of times in the world. Sometimes we'll be presented with something that the scriptures clearly says is either right or wrong, and we could just leave it in a small-minded sort of do or do not sense, or we could think about it in the bigger picture. And some folks will say, look at this thing. Should we not follow this so that we could really demonstrate love to the people around us? I mean, I'm trying to demonstrate love to this person or to that person, or I'm trying to do right by this person or that person. But the problem is, it totally depends on how you define love and right and do good by somebody and different things like that. Because oftentimes in our world today especially, we can go out into the world and justify all sorts of things by saying, well, this is about love. Now notice what Jesus says there in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 40. He says, of these two commandments, or rather on these two commandments, to love God and to love your neighbor, depend the whole law and the prophets. They're the linchpin. They're the beginning of this. And so if I go through my life and I attempt to tamper with these things, or I'm resistant to even listening to it, I say, you know what, I got a lot on my plate right now and I just don't even want to think about it. I don't want to give up the things that I want to do. That if I tamper with those things, I'm attempting to circumvent love, even if at times I might use love as an excuse for that, or at least my definition of love. And so if I try to tamper with this, if you look back in Matthew chapter 5, once more in verse 19, where Jesus doesn't say tamper, he says here in New American Standard, annuls one of the least of these commandments, circumvents one of the least of these commandments, and then teaches also other people to do the same, this is a problem. According to the way that Jesus defines what the greatest commandments are and the way that love and hatred are defined in the scriptures, the person who tampers with these things not only is causing a problem for themselves, but truly hates God and hates the people around them, even though they say, I'm loving you through this, when God has expressed the details for it. This person, Jesus says, is not worthy of the kingdom of heaven, or in other words, called least in the kingdom of heaven. As we look through this verse, I want to present something to you, and this is like a take it or leave it. It's a thought that I've had, and you can see if it makes sense to you or not. What I think is going on here when he talks about least or great in the kingdom of heaven, I think what he means here is from the perspective of the kingdom of heaven, kind of looking outwards and objectively to people and behavior and character, it looks and it says, this is least. This is a small thing. This is not a good thing. And then it will look at some and it will say, this is great. This is a good thing. This is good moral character. This is their obedience to love as the fulfillment of all things. And so I think it's like the kingdom looking outward. And maybe that's just me, maybe that's not what's going on here, but it makes a little more sense, I think, of this passage. Because he says, those who annul the least of these commandments and teach others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven, especially when the kingdom appears in a few chapters, really, of this book. Now, look at the next verse as we continue on. The person then who is worthy of the kingdom of heaven is a person who keeps these things. But how can you keep all of these things? You do it through love. It's an impossibility to have all of them in mind and do them all without flaw throughout the entirety of your life, which is required. But you sum all those up and you put them in a box and you do them every day of your life and you live them if love is your single-minded concern. And so the person who then keeps the law that way, the person who teaches the law that way, that person is great in the kingdom of heaven. They look to the inward parts, the moral character, and then they look to love as the defining rule or standard of living. Now look at verse 20. He says, "For I say to you," and this is a supporting point, it's a concluding point as well, "I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, this is one more point that we need to bring up, is that love, when lived in good character, brings righteousness. And so character plus law, rule or standard of living, which is love, brings about righteousness, which is required to be in a relationship with God. He is righteousness and can have no part with unrighteousness. Light, no part with darkness, and so on and so forth. So to be righteous, these are the things which must happen first. Now notice how he compares there the other people, the Pharisees, in verse 20, that your righteousness needs to surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Think about how their righteousness came to them. Their righteousness came to them by the enlargement of the borders of their garments, by the enlargement of the phylacteries, those little boxes that they would wear on their head with pieces of the law contained therein, with their observance of ritual cleansings and their traditions, and also all the other points of the law and the Talmud and the Mishnah and their commentaries, to do all of these things with perfection and call other people out when they had messed up these things. That's how they found their righteousness. But there's a parable that Jesus talks about with the tax collector and the Pharisee, where he explains that it is self-righteousness, and therefore no righteousness at all. The real righteousness that is required here, the righteousness which would exceed self-righteousness, is a righteousness you and I cannot grant to ourselves. It is a righteousness that is provided by grace. And so he says, "I say to you that unless you're better than them," and they were keeping all of these details and points, "you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." How can you be better in practice, like in observational quality, than the people who seem to be flawless? You do it by the grace of God. With men, entrance into the kingdom of heaven is impossible. With God, it is very much possible. But it can only be possible to a people who has a character and has single-minded devotion to love in the way that God defines it. And there's one last point I want to bring up before we close this lesson, and here's another point that the law can never bring out. In fact, we'll skip this here for a second. And that is desire. Now, when I think about the law, I think about like law as in rule or standard of living within our country, the laws that are on the books, and you know, say federal code, all this and all these weird symbols that I don't understand what they mean. That as you look through all of the law, I think of restriction more than I think of like opening to things. In other words, generally speaking, our country is designed in such a way where you are allowed to do whatever you want unless you mess up somebody else. And so more of our laws are going to be restrictive than they are like go and get it sort of laws. Just you can do whatever you want to, and we don't have to tell you how to do what you want to do. Just don't do things that hurt other people. And so when I think of the law, I think about it as not being particularly motivating. I'll have my own desires that I want to do, and if my desire is to not contribute anything of value to society but sit on the couch all day and eat potato chips, then that's my desire, and you really can't make me want anything else. And you can pass a law that says you can only spend so many minutes on the couch each day and different things like that, or else you go to prison for 20 years, and I'll get off the couch and I'll go to work, but I won't like it. And so the law doesn't change anything within the heart. That goes kind of back to our first point. I remember my dad would come back home sometimes, and he's a California highway patrolman. He's retired now, but he'd come back with the California Penal Code, this big old tome that he would sit down on the counter because he would be going to court and would need to memorize some things. And just the law is just restriction after restriction after restriction. It doesn't create in me anything that wants to follow it because I love it. I hate reading the California Penal Code. And so what the law does in this kingdom, and remember, the rule or standard of living, which is character coupled with love, it creates desire, something that nothing else on this earth can do. Now, remember, James talks about temptation as in being rooted in our desires, that we desire the things that we want, the things that make us feel good, and when we act on those things, sin has now taken root in our lives as that reality, and it's actuated, and then it produces death, which is what it always does. And so, my desires need to change, if sin is concerned especially. But how do I do that when we're talking about law in the typical sense of speaking? Well, we're not, thank the Lord. So let's see how he creates desire for us. Earthly laws don't address motivation, this necessary point. What this law does is it enables people to be where they want to live. And we'll explain that here in a moment. Go to chapter 6 and verse 24, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. And really, actually, what we're going to kind of do is we're going to work backwards through this text. It's a very familiar text to us. I want to look at it just a different way to see if we can learn at least something else from it that maybe we haven't thought of before. So go down to verse 32 first, and we'll go backwards. Here he says, as he speaks about desire and what things you and I want, he speaks about some of those most basic needs and necessities and desires. He says, the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows, that you need all these things being food and clothing. Those are basic human desires and necessities. And if you ever say to yourself, well, I don't desire food, well, wait a couple seconds, and that grumbling will tell you, you really do. And so everyone on earth desires food and clothing, and it's been that way since the very beginning. So, if that's what everybody wants, and that's even what the Gentiles want, Jesus says, that's kind of almost derogatory as far as the Jews would consider it, right? Like the Jews are the best, and the Gentiles are those guys. And so he says, even the Gentiles want that stuff. So everybody wants these things. So this is our desire typically, in a general sense of speaking, to fill our bellies. Paul will talk about this in one of his letters where he'll say that people's gods are their bellies. And that the idea behind that is their desire to feed themselves with whatever they crave. And isn't it interesting how Jesus talks about that character trait in the Beatitudes? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They will be filled. Now, in verse 32, we realize here that everyone is concerned with their own interests. One of the first lessons you learn in economics is that human wants are unlimited. So it's not even just food and clothing. You and I have Amazon wish lists and different things which never get filled up. So you and I will always want things. Now, look at your life and assess yourself honestly. Are you concerned with things like that a lot of the time? And it might not be that case for all of you, but I know that it's that case for me a lot. And I mean, I have all my bills on automatic pay, and I still worry about them from time to time. I get stressed out. And so if that's the case for me, Jesus says, hey, you're like everyone else, first of all, but that's not okay. It's a diagnostic, or rather a symptom of something else. And so that's what I mean here, where we're going to back up. Because verse 32 and 33, or rather 31 and 32, these are symptoms of an illness, of a character flaw. We'll go back up a few verses, go to verse 25, and I would suggest to you that if you and I are concerned and are worried often, or really at all, about our own interests, our own bellies, our own clothing, and so on and so forth, you and I then are worried when God asks us not to be, when God really commands us not to be. Verse 25, he says, for this reason I say to you, Do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? And sometimes when I read that, I go, well, sort of, but if I don't eat, I'll die. So yeah, it's important. Here's where the law comes back into this, our previous points. Here's a detail that Jesus brings out, and let's pretend that I didn't know anything at all until I read this verse. God presents to me a detail, and here is a do, or really, rather a do not. Do not be worried. Well, how can I satisfy this to its greatest sense? Not just in behavior modification, but in my inner self, in my character. Well, it comes through love. And it comes with being concerned with, in my root, in my mind, in my very inner self, being concerned with not the food and the clothing, but the righteousness that I crave for. That's how I can fulfill this. But he says to us still here though, don't be worried about your life. So if I have interests, and if I'm worried about those interests, that's also still a symptom of the greater problem. And we back up another verse to verse 24. The greater problem here, especially as it concerns the kingdom of heaven, is that I am serving two masters. There are two kings in my life, and there's only room on the throne for one. In verse 24, he says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. What Jesus says here is very interesting to me. I would think there towards the last part of that verse, like, wouldn't it be good to be devoted to God and despise wealth? Like, wouldn't that be a good thing? It's still distracting. There's still two kings that are present. I can say I hate the other one all day long that I want, but he's still there. What Jesus is telling us here is to get rid of that other king. There's two kings and one's got to go. Now, if I serve one master, then I will not be concerned about my life. Or rather, if I serve the right master, the good master, I will not be concerned about the things that he can provide if he wants to at any time, and he's faithful in his promises to do so. And if that's the case, then I realize down into verses 30 and 31, I really don't have any worries anymore. My only concerns and interests are the same things that he's concerned and interested about, which is the progression of the kingdom of heaven, the glorification of his Son and his magnification thereby. That's the only thing I want. And if that's the only thing I want, God will take care of all the other stuff. And there I fulfill all of the dominion's rule or standard of living because I had one king and with character pursued only love of him, and everything else followed. Look down a few more verses to chapter 7 and verse 21. Chapter 7 and verse 21. In fact, actually, strike that. Let's go back to chapter 6 and verse 33. We really do need to finish with these couple of verses. Verse 33 of chapter 6, he gives us really the conclusion of that point. Seek first his kingdom. That's the solution. And his righteousness, that which comes by what God grants through grace by faith. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Let's add one more addendum in here. That righteousness which surpasses the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. But do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness thereby. What I think Jesus says here, I don't think he's saying seek first and then seek others second. Because if you seek first the kingdom, if that takes first place, it fills up all the rest that you've got. There's no room anymore to seek second. I have a lot of folks approach me at the building, and they'll come and they'll ask for things, and they'll have concerns, and really it's very sad, kind of just where life goes. And whether, again, like we talked about the other day, whether the bad things that are happening in their life, and I say bad as far as negative and uncomfortable, whether these things are happening in their life because of consequences for their decisions, or they're the innocent bystanders of the consequences of other people's decisions, it's still a sad existence. And sometimes I'll help, and sometimes I'm not able, and sometimes it doesn't seem like quite a good idea in that case. And when I look at these people, and when we talk about these things, I always remind them of this passage. Things will work out, things will be picked up and carried out if you seek first the kingdom. And that is such a heavy saying, and I'm afraid that many people don't pay attention to it. And I'm afraid that we often, too, don't pay attention to it. What it means to seek first and then thereby only the kingdom and his righteousness. It will consume you to your very core, to your character. Okay, let's go to chapter 7 now and finish up with this point. And chapter 7 and verse 21 is related to this. Jesus here brings out a point as we're talking about continually and foremostly seeking the kingdom of heaven and righteousness and this ruler standard of living. Notice here that Jesus talks still about that being split and that double-minded and that following of two kings. He says in verse 21 something that is incredibly frightening and should cause us to consider and assess ourselves again. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,'" and remember that's king language. You could just as easily say, "Not everyone who says to me, 'King, King, Master, Master, Chief, Sovereign, and Authority.' Not everyone who says those things will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter." What's his will? It's love. We talked about it. In verse 22, he says, "But many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not?'" And what they're going to say here is, fill in the check marks. Go through the bullet points. We did the things. We didn't do the other things. Verse 22, he says, "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name cast out demons? And in your name perform many miracles?'" And I mean, I've not done that stuff, and that sounds really cool. But Jesus says to them, in fact, he says, "I will declare to them." It's this revealing and manifestation of eternal truth. "I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" What these people did is they list a few things. And I'm reminded of the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee again, where he says, I tithe twice a week, I fast every day, I do all these different things. What other things did he not do? Or maybe what things did he all do but forget that one and great important point? And these people here too, they have listed some things here, but what other things did they not do? Rather, what one thing did they forget in their entire life? They went through the points, they went through the motions and the details, and that ended up in that they did some really cool, neat stuff. But they also didn't do some others. And they forgot love. And because of that, the king says, "You were never a member of my kingdom. I never had association with you. We never had fellowship together. I never knew you." This is so important then for us as we bring all these points together, is that character is required within the kingdom, something that law cannot legislate. And the law then, coupled with that, which is to love God first and foremost, and then everything else follows, will satisfy everything else required. And if you, with a desire to seek first, and that goes back to character, live your life in a single-minded devotion to God's love as he defines it, you will not have to be concerned about anything again. We talked about the other night in preparation for the kingdom how preparation creates a confidence in us. You don't have to worry if you've got all your stuff in your backpack that you'll ever need. The New Testament in so many places, and 1 John is one of my favorites, talks about how this is how you can have confidence that you are God's children, that you're members of the kingdom, that you have eternal life. That's how he finishes up his letter in 1 John. I want to finish up with this point. Jesus does not recognize those who make themselves kings and masters with their desires. He doesn't recognize those who have competing kings with him or for him. He recognizes only those who recognize only him as chief sovereign and authority over all creation and eternity. Go to chapter 7 as we finish. As Jesus presents these teachings and many more that we just didn't have time to cover, he teaches these things as someone entirely different. Remember that Paul says in Galatians, the law is a tutor. In fact, he uses the word a schoolmaster to lead us to faith, lead us to these things. The law was there for a purpose, to instruct us about sin and how it operates in the world. The law is there, and all of these commandments that Jesus had spoken of in Matthew 5 were there for a reason. And they're kind of now secondhand teachers to us. And even the people that would speak with these listeners here at this time in the Sermon on the Mount, the rabbis and the other scribes, are teaching them as people who are taking something they did not create and just conveying it to someone else. And really, brethren, that's what I'm doing right now too. I didn't make this. All I'm doing is I'm taking something given to me to give to you. And so I'm kind of this unnecessary middleman in some senses of speaking. Now notice how the people heard him when he spoke his sermon. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. The crowds have been amazed at these teachings for thousands of years. But notice what they say in verse 29. They notice that he was teaching them as one having authority, like a king, not as one of their scribes. When we look to these things, when we look to this character and the law that he calls us to, and this desire that it creates within us, he says it not just as a tutor, he says it as the chief sovereign among all. How important then is it that we listen to our only King and Savior, our Redeemer, the Christ? In just a moment, we'll have another lesson as we'll finish up these things and make some final application. But you have an opportunity now, as long as we have breath, to come to the kingdom and to make him your only king. And to, as is often said by some of our friends, to accept Christ as Lord. What does that mean? To love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. And when the details are presented to you, you'll jump them. You'll get right across to it. Now, God asks us for the remission of sins, so that righteousness can be given by grace, that we by faith must be baptized. And if you want to start your entrance, we could almost say your citizenship into the kingdom of heaven, you can do so right now. Consider that if you would, please. And let's stand and sing a song together.